Hi everybody, welcome to my channel. I'm Stacy. If you're new here, welcome in. If you're coming back, I'm glad to have you. Today, let's talk about the nursing perspective from being a patient. If you like what I talk about and you want to hear more, then I ask that you like, subscribe, and follow for more. Let's get into it. So I have been thinking about stories that you hear in other social media outlets where people have said they're a nurse when they're a patient. And for the most part, I think as nurses, we don't like to tell people that we're nurses when we're on the other side of the bed. However, sometimes I don't think that's such a bad thing. I mean, it doesn't hurt me to know that someone's a nurse. I mean, I guess if someone is not being receptive or they're being rude or, any of those things, then I guess it would be negative to say that you're a nurse. That being said, because of the negativity surrounding that, I have very rarely willingly given that information. But I would like to talk about my experiences as a nurse, as a patient. I have mostly had good experiences as a patient who is a nurse. And there's not too many things that I could complain about. I have a lot of respect for nurses, especially nurses who work in ER or trauma or ICU. Those are all things that I simply could not do, and I have so much respect for that. In fact, I have respect for many and all nurses in every aspect that they do. For instance, labor and delivery. Definitely something I don't want to do, especially after my experiences, which is where I'm leading up to. So I waited to get pregnant until I was 31, and the whole pregnancy was just rough. I had chronic all-day sickness, not morning sickness. And I experienced a lot of scares, swelling. I spent time on bed rest. There was always that concern that I wasn't going to make it through the pregnancy with a baby. So when I went to the hospital, I was induced because I was at 39 weeks and I was huge and my toes looked like sausages. If you've ever been pregnant, you know how that is. So disclaimer, this could get a little bit graphic, but I'll try not to be too graphic about it. I was an LPN at the time that I had my son. I was about 31 years old, and I didn't know much about labor and delivery. I had read the What to Expect When You're Expecting book, but I was a geriatric nurse and that was my area. I understood what would be happening with folks that were, up in age, but not babies. So I didn't know what to expect, and I did not know the complications that could arise. And the only thing that I would like to say about the whole experience is that I wish there was a little bit more compassion, and I certainly wish there was a lot more education. When I became an RN and I went to school and saw that my experience was a textbook experience that should have alerted the nurses who were experienced in that field to do something different. My water was broke. Then they put me on Pitocin drip and an epidural was placed. During that process, I did not know the signs that maybe the cord was around my baby's neck, that maybe my baby was in distress. The nurse said to me, and maybe this should have been a clue, did anyone tell you how big this baby's going to be? I mean, yes, I knew he was going to be a big baby because I was huge at the end of my pregnancy. And he, in fact, was 10 pounds and 22 inches long. And he did, in fact, come out the natural way, which I would not recommend. I am not tall, I'm short-waisted, and the poor little guy didn't have any room. I mean, basically, I birthed a toddler. The thing about it is that I feel those nurses knew that my baby was in distress and that I was in distress, and there were also 2 other babies being born at the same time as mine. And I feel that maybe they were stressed looking at it in hindsight. Because the doctor who was my doctor was responsible for all 3 of those babies. The thing is, every time I turned on my left side, my baby's heart rate would drop. When I got the epidural, I, of course, bottomed out. And they had to give me, I want to say epinephrine, but I'm not 100% sure that that's what happened because it's all a blur. And I just remember I felt extremely nauseous and my blood pressure dropped to like 60/40. And it was an emergency situation. The next things I remember are very blurry because the whole thing was just a traumatic experience. I'm just going to be honest with you. Childbirth is a miracle, and when you come out with a live baby, I really understand the idea of bringing life into the world as a miracle. When your baby takes their first breath, that truly is a miracle. The things that should have alerted my nurses that something wasn't right were, number one, his heart rate dropping every time I turned on my side. Number two, I was huge. If they knew my baby was that big, I should have just been a C-section. They shouldn't have been trying to make little me push out a big baby. It shouldn't have happened, but it did. The other thing is, my doctor came in and said, this was a textbook C-section. Why wasn't I called sooner? I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. You're going to tear. Now it was an emergency to get my baby out. And in doing so, he was injured during birth. It is a story that I haven't talked about in a long time because it's always an emotional story. The epidural came out when I was in the bed. I said to my nurse, hey, I'm really feeling these contractions. I was in labor for 12 hours. I pushed for 2 hours, maybe more. I feel like it was 2 hours. My child was born at 11:11, and he didn't breathe. When he came out, he was blue. It turns out the cord was around his neck, and they pulled the nerves from his shoulder from his spinal cord, and his arm was limp. Finally, he did breathe, which was a delight to my ears. But there was a lot of lack of education in my experience. For example, the lactation consultant didn't tell me that when you have a birth injury from your baby, nor did the doctor for that matter, that they might not be able to nurse easily, that they would not have that rooting reflex, that they would not be able to nurse on that side easily. I'm just so thankful for my mom in that experience because she had nursed 5 children and really got me through that whole experience. But I wish that my lactation consultants and the nurses in the hospital would have given me more education. I'm pretty sure they knew I was a nurse because one of the nursing students was a coworker of mine and asked if she could put the catheter in, and I agreed, and I said we were all students once. So I think they knew I was a nurse, but I didn't know anything about childbirth. So in that case, I wish they would have given me signs to watch for when I went home, all sorts of things. When I got home with my newborn baby and I wasn't producing very much colostrum, I had to supplement with formula for a little while. I got an excruciating migraine and went back to the hospital with a high blood pressure, extremely high. They told me I just needed to rest. Looking back at everything that happened, it was the perfect storm. And honestly, I probably should have had a blood patch. Things that I didn't know until years later when I became a registered nurse and I went through the maternity section of nursing. I thought, oh my God, this is exactly what happened to me. And these are the things that exactly I experienced. And I was angry that nobody explained that to me. So yes, I was a nurse. And I'm sure that people knew I was a nurse, not because I said, hey, I'm a nurse, but because my colleagues were present. People that I had worked with were present during this experience. And I would just like to say that just because someone is a nurse doesn't mean that their education level isn't where the nurse's education level is, especially if we work in a different field. That is the thing that I recognize about nursing. When I have patients who are nurses that have worked in a different field, they probably don't know necessarily everything that maybe I know about hospice. And so I would not assume that they didn't need further education. It's just the whole experience. And that's really the biggest bad experience I've ever had. Generally, when I've been in the hospital or I've been in a situation where I needed to be a patient and not a nurse, I've had a pretty good experience. But I guess my takeaway from this is that it shouldn't be negative to say you're a nurse, but it also shouldn't be a power thing. You know, like if I say I'm a nurse, it isn't a power thing. I just want you to know it's okay for you to speak frankly to me. It's okay for you to share your knowledge with me. It's okay for you to speak to me in medical terminology because I understand what you're saying generally. I don't know about the meds that you're pushing. I don't know any of that stuff, but you can talk to me frankly because I'm a nurse, you're a nurse, so give it to me straight. That's where I'm at if I tell you I'm a nurse. It's because you don't have to tiptoe around things with me. But I really wish that you would understand that you can give other nurses more education. Is this going to be received negatively? Perhaps, but I want you to know that I rarely tell people I'm a nurse for this reason alone. However, that being said, if you have an experience where you're not treated professionally or you're not treated with the care and compassion that you should be treated with, I think it should be brought up as a teaching moment for sure. I want to know if I do something wrong, and many times I have been told if I communicated with somebody wrong, if I could have handled a situation better. So I think it's important because we're just humans. We're nurses, but we're just humans. Moving on from that, I also had to have chemotherapy for ITP. And that was an experience in and of itself. I had to get labs every week. I was on high doses of steroids, ended up with some shingles, had some experiences. You know, when you are on chemo, your hemoglobin drops, your immune system is down. And when you're on high steroids, you don't have any pain in your body, but you get infections and you can't sleep. And you're angry at the world. I don't know what it's like to be on any stimulants, but I can assume that being on prednisone on a high dose is a pretty close match for that, because I tell you what, my house was the cleanest it has ever been in my life when I was on 150 milligrams of prednisone a day. And I was hungry. So that being said, I had an experience where I had a vasovagal episode where I passed out after a hot shower. My oncologist, hematologist did share with me that I should not be taking hot showers. And I learned that, you know, when you're on chemo and your hemoglobin's low, you can't breathe. It takes you forever to get anywhere when you're walking, when you're doing things. And I had a toddler at the time, so I was always in a rush and I always had something to do. Plus I was in nursing school, finishing my ADN. And I fell and fainted and hit my head. So my mom likes to tell people I'm a nurse, but I wish she wouldn't. Because in this case, I really wasn't having good judgment, and I kept saying I was fine and I didn't need anything, but I really needed a CT because I was not fine and I was talking out of my head. And my mother even said, hey, this is not how my daughter talks. I promise you this is not normal, even though I seemed perfectly normal. And I kept saying I'm fine. I had hit my head, I had fainted, and on a porcelain toilet of all things. So I probably should have been checked because, you know, I wasn't a little girl and I fell from standing. So just to say, just because I'm a nurse doesn't mean that you shouldn't do all the things. No matter what I'm saying to you, if I hit my head and I'm not being myself, please do all the things for me. Please don't believe me if I hit my head and someone tells you I'm not myself. The other thing is, my best friend is a nurse, and I am very thankful for that because I did experience infant loss and miscarriage. It's a word we don't want to talk about. I was at work, it happened, I was hemorrhaging, I drove myself to the hospital, and my friend met me there, and I'm so thankful she did because, of course, I was going into shock. And I felt very peaceful about the whole thing. I wasn't panicked at all, but God love her, she took very good care of me, and she was the most compassionate nurse during that time. Not just my best friend, but a very compassionate, caring nurse for me at that time. And she made sure that I wasn't forgotten because the ER gets busy, and I'm a very understanding person of that. I know there are people that are having emergencies, and there are people that have been in car accidents, there are people with limbs hanging off, there are things happening in the ER that are urgent, but I feel like hemorrhaging is pretty urgent. And in this particular case, I'm from a small town, so it was really small town things. I have been in big cities and seen how big hospitals work and been thoroughly impressed with their emergency department, how they handle things. I've been thoroughly impressed with the ICUs and the nurses working in there, and my God, that's where I get my massive respect for. I've seen trauma ICU, I've seen neuro ICU, I've seen cardiac ICU, and those nurses are rocking it. So when I'm talking about this, I'm truly just talking about my small town experience in my hometown. And I suppose that could be worse for anyone in their own hometown than it would be as a stranger somewhere. That being said, for the most part, I've had great experiences, great nurses, and I would just encourage you to be patient as a patient with nurses when they are doing their things, and remember yourself when you're thinking of how you're waiting. Think of how many times you've been busy and knew you needed to get to that patient in that room, but you couldn't get there because you couldn't get out of what you were doing. And even in long-term care, we have emergencies where we can't get to the patient that's waiting for us. So I do understand that things happen, but I just thought I would share those things from a patient perspective as a nurse. And I wondered, have you ever experienced anything that traumatized you as a patient? What do you wish would have happened different? I'd love to hear about it. Is there any time that you didn't want to tell somebody, a nurse, or that someone told somebody that you were a nurse. You were so embarrassed. Don't be embarrassed. Be proud of it. I would love to talk about it in the comments, and if you like what we talk about here, then I ask that you like, subscribe, and follow for more. Thank you for watching. I hope to see you soon.